Apparently Blizzard agreed that those naturally skilled solo shuffle demon hunters needed some nerfs. And while they were at it, feral druid of all things was the spec to get buffed because, well, reasons, I guess. Anyway, we will be covering the biggest winners and losers for all the recent balance changes and predict where each spec will fall on our tier list. So stay tuned for our Season 1 Solo Shuffle meta update. And for all the demon hunters out there sad about these nerfs, don't worry because we found a new keyboard just for you. For legal reasons, we're totally joking. But hey, isn't it nice when the game feels simple? With how crazy Arena can be, sometimes it can feel like a mess knowing exactly what to do, which makes climbing the ladder feel like an impossible task. But with Skill Capped, we guarantee that you can gain over 400 points this season while actively using our guides. Yes, that's right, with hundreds of videos being pumped out each season, there is a reason why every Skill Capped member is able to stay ahead of the meta. With our damage and healing guides, you can learn how to perfect your rotation and top the meters until you hit the highest ranks. And with our new Master in Minutes guides, you can get exclusive insight into the advanced tips and tricks being used by the pros. So if you're wanting to power up your rating this season, visit the link below for an exclusive invite offer to join skillcap.com today. Anyway, back to the tier list. In this video, we're going to cover the most important tier list changes, starting with the biggest winners for melee DPS. First up, we have Unholy DK moving its way up the S tier. Despite some nerfs early in the season, the spec has managed to death grip a slot as the second most represented melee above 2400 in solo shuffle. This came after a series of damage buffs a few weeks ago, which more than offset its defensive nerfs earlier in the season. Look, if you've played any solo shuffle so far, you know how much AoE pressure Unholy DKs are able to pump out, and without any major nerfs on the horizon, we think they definitely deserve their spot on the S tier. We're also moving Feral Druid up to the S tier for now, as it's more than exceeded our expectations so far this season. The spec did get a very minor damage buff, which will help add to its enormous AoE pressure thanks to Primal Wrath. More importantly though, Assassination Rogues did receive some minor nerfs, which we will be discussing later. In any case, in the ecosystem of solo shuffle, a big nerf to your biggest threat is a passive buff. And when you combine this with a minor damage increase across the board, Feral is looking good for the rest of the season. Moving down the tier list a bit, we are making the decision to move Arms Warrior up to the A tier. Although the spec didn't really receive any super impactful changes with this recent round of balancing, it is still a dark horse for melee DPS in Dragonflight. After a relatively weak start to the expansion, Arms is seeing a resurgence in popularity due to some key damage buffs coupled with nerfs to Fury Warrior. With the reintroduction of Ignore Pain on the horizon, we could definitely see Arms Warrior Heroic leaping its way up the tier list in a future update. For our final melee DPS winner, we have Ret Paladins. Look, Ret clearly had a slow start to Dragonflight. Formerly one of the most threatening melee DPS in Shadowlands, the spec as a whole has failed to thrive in the new expansion. But with a couple of buffs to some damage spells and with some CDR on Shield of Vengeance, Ret could be clawing its way back. Despite these buffs, we still think the spec will struggle a bit in solo shuffle. Without an MS effect and with increased dampening being a core feature of the solo shuffle bracket, Ret isn't too well equipped to be a standalone spec in the meta and can easily get shafted by unlucky lobbies. With our biggest melee winners out of the way, let's take a look at the biggest losers and cover the specs that might be taking a bit of a dive. This might come as a huge surprise, but Demon Hunters are the first spec on the chopping block. With nerfs to both its burst potential and tankiness, DH might slowly cycle its way out of the top melee DPS slot. Look, as the highest represented spec in the solo bracket in literally every region and rating bracket, it was clear that Demon Hunter was due for some nerfs. At this point, it has become a bit of a meme how good the spec was performing, but now its reign might finally be over. The same is true for Assassination Rogue, which is a spec that is a bit harder to gauge in PvP. That's because at the highest end of the ladder, it is one of the most represented melee in solo shuffle. But going down in rating, it actually gets dwarfed by other specs, barely beating out Ret Paladins for representation above 1800. With a key damage nerf to Garrett, we could see Assassination Rogue losing some steam and becoming less of a threat overall. As the rogue spec with the least amount of tankiness, any damage nerf really cuts deep into its main selling point, so for now, we are moving Assassination down to the A tier. Finally, we have a fairly bold prediction to make, and that is moving Windwalker Monk down to the B tier. Don't get us wrong, their damage will still likely be scary, but with a major nerf to Skyreach, their one true gimmick will be less potent in Arena. Windwalker is already a fairly fragile melee spec, and a nerf to its one-shot could potentially put it further behind other high-tier melee. And with that, we have our full prediction for the solo shuffle meta after recent hotfixes. Unholy DKs and feral druids will sit comfortably on top of the damage throne, especially now with key nerfs to assassination rogues and demon hunters. Red paladins might wind up being a dark horse for the middle of the season, picking up some key buffs to both their offensive and defensive toolkits. Overall though, the bracket continues to revolve around massive sustained damage, which might leave some of the mid and low tier specs behind. With our melee covered, let's cover the biggest winners of ranged DPS following recent hotfixes. For now, we are moving Elemental Shaman up an entire tier, where we predict it will be in a class of its own. Oddly enough, Shaman didn't really see any recent major changes, so why on earth would we be moving it higher? Well, with key nerfs to both Acid Rogues and Demon Hunters, we think Ellie will have slightly fewer threats in the meta. Of course, the spec is still prone to getting trained by melee DPS, but its damage profile continues to shine in the bracket, where it is able to deal huge sustained pressure, combined with huge waves of burst. Next up, we are predicting that Destro Warlock might actually rise up an entire tier. This comes on the back of some damage buffs. Obviously, some of these are PvE only, but overall the spec is getting some much needed tuning. With that said, the core problem with Destro Warlock is its tankiness, specifically the fact that its mastery no longer provides damage reduction. But with some key nerfs to the most oppressive melee, Destro should be noticeably stronger in the weeks to come. The same is true for Affliction Warlock. This is a spec that we might have overhyped prior to Season 1. On paper, it seemed to have everything needed for the solo meta, which generally just meant lots of damage. Turns out Blizzard thought the solution to their lackluster performance was simply more damage. More dots is never really a bad thing, is it? Anyway, with damage buffs across the board, we think it might finally be time for Affliction to thrive in the solo bracket. With all of the quality of life improvements to the spec going into Dragonflight, maybe having more damage is the true key to its success. Finally, we are predicting that Devastation Evoker might be a huge winner after recent tuning. In general though, this is a class that is really hard to predict because it is a true glass cannon. And once again, Blizzard's solution to Evoker defensive complaints was to simply give them more damage. A bit weird if we are being honest, but certainly not off-brand for a class that looks like a flying reptile. Anyway, after this round of tuning, Evoker might actually be in a competitive spot. Of course, its defensives are still far behind other high tiers, but with future buffs in that department, Evoker could find a spot among the high tiers eventually. Now that we've covered the biggest winners of ranged DPS, let's swing back and cover the unfortunate losers for the recent rounds of tuning. First up, we will actually be moving Demo Warlock down an entire tier. This is due to some fairly significant damage nerfs to some core abilities, which arrive at a time where Demo is in contention for the top range DPS slot. And for all you Demo mains, don't be alarmed. Being on the A tier still means your spec is highly competitive, but now it will be noticeably weaker into some of the other high tiers. The same is true for Shadow Priest, who were widely considered the best ranged DPS in the game for the first few weeks of the season. Shadow is getting hit by a few key nerfs, including a small reduction to some passive defense, as well as a wave of damage nerfs inside of PvP. Taken together, these are all pretty significant, and we predict that they will set the spec back an entire tier. Again though, being on the A tier isn't bad at all, and we expect Shadow Priest to continue performing well, even at the highest end of the ladder. And with that, we have our prediction for the ranged DPS solo shuffle meta after recent tuning. The bracket is clearly more friendly to melee DPS, but we think Elemental Shaman may have a better shot now that some of its biggest counters were hit with nerfs. The biggest wildcard will continue to be Devastation Evoker, who is the true glass cannon of WoW. With any future defensive buffs, it could easily become a highly dominant spec in the solo meta. Now that we've covered all the DPS slots, let's wrap things up with healers, starting with the biggest winners. First up is Resto Shaman. We will be honest, this spec definitely took us by surprise. Even though they didn't receive any tuning, we are still going to move them up to the A tier. When we originally predicted the solo shuffle meta, we figured shamans might struggle due to their relatively weak healing output, but who needs to heal when you can just pump out damage? Aside from its obvious offensive strengths, shamans are starting to do really well thanks to a shift over to a build with primal tied core and deeply rooted elements, giving them higher chances to proc ascendance. With a flashy new build that helps with their healing output, we think Resto Shamans will start to feel more complete, and we think they are the one healing spec that truly exceeded our expectations. On that note, we will also be moving Holy Priest up to the B tier. This comes with a bit of a disclaimer. First, the good news. The spec got some pretty significant healing increases to its core rotational spells. On paper, this is really good, but don't get too excited. One of the main issues with Holy Priest in Dragonflight is that it actually needs to cast. Really, more than any other healer, Holy needs to simply plant its feet and churn out casts. This is easier said than done in a bracket where people are constantly line of sighting you and running around like easily distracted dogs. So don't get too excited. Even though Holy Priest might be moving up, it still has a lot of work to do. On that note, we have Mistweaver Monk as a winner, but we are actually moving it down a tier since our last meta update. Yes, even though Mistweaver Monk is getting some decent healing buffs across the board, it still faces some glaring issues. For one, just like Holy Priest, Mistweaver is one of the few healers that actually needs to plant its feet and open its cast bar. Again, this is a bigger issue in solo shuffle, where half of the time one of your DPS is completely unaware they are playing arena with and against actual human beings. Even though Mistweaver Monk healing output will continue to be high, we don't really see it performing at the same level as the other high tiers for now. With that said, we have our predictions for the healer meta after recent tuning. To nobody's surprise, Resto Druid and Preservation Evoker will likely remain on top, but will now be challenged by the two aggressive healers who are proving that sometimes the best defense is a good offense. Anyway, as a reminder, these are just our predictions, and when the dust settles, we will be giving you a more complete meta update accompanied by data. And speaking of data, we want to remind you that you can join over 500,000 lifetime users at skillcap.com by taking advantage of our rating gain guarantee, where we promise that you will gain over 400 rating this season while using our website. Visit the discount link below to start your journey and get ahead of the meta today by using skillcap.com. For now though, that wraps up this update. As always, we want to thank you all for watching. See you soon.